You're watching the intersection of money and power. This is Political Capital. I'm Karabole Tata. This week belongs to the greatest South African of all time. A man who 100 years ago came into the world he would later change. On the show, we will be highlighting Nelson Mandela's political legacy and how his politics continue to affect South Africa, Africa, and the world. Later in the show, South Africa will on Wednesday host some of the most powerful leaders in the world during the 10th BRICS Summit in Johannesburg. This Congress of Emerging Economies of Southern Hemisphere, who last year did 462 billion rands in trade. Among these presidents will be one who has sway with American President Donald Trump. So, how, after seeing what happened in Helsinki on Monday, can BRICS and South Africa leverage Vladimir Putin's political currency with Donald Trump to push their own economic agendas? We have more on the show, but first up, Nelson Mandela Week.
It's just him.
Well, he was a great guy, he was an historical man.
The living conditions are better.
I think Nelson Mandela is an overglorified South African hero.
Inspiration to all.
People are moving away from what Ubuntu means.
Well, I'm a fan, obviously.
We must just find our Mandela.
Nelson Mandela was destined to cause a stir. His character inspired emotions in people the world over. Some good, some bad, seldom indifferent. As a young political activist in the 50s, Mandela flirted with fire and danger, an early proponent of the armed struggle at a time when Chief Albert Luthuli, then ANC president, won the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1960. And when that fierce spirit gave way to a negotiated settlement in 1994, some accused him of bending over backwards. Mandela's politics continue to be divisive today, even more so as a new youthful generation begin to question the implications of his politics on their daily lives.
It's time for other heroes to take the spotlight as well, like Robert Sobukwe.
But there's more to South Africa than Mandela.
I think in the first place, Mandela should have just not sold us out.
He was a father to every African in the world.
Too many people take the parts of Nelson Mandela they like and ignore the parts that don't dovetail with their own preconceptions. And I think everybody does this.
Adam Habib is the principal of one of the best seats of learning in Africa, the University of Witwatersrand. Habib has published numerous books and journals over the last 2 decades. A few years after his appointment as vice-chancellor, his university was hit by the biggest student protest since democracy. Mandela's born-free generation had come to collect their free education.
We need to challenge the current generation. To be honest, I think we romanticize the current generation. There's much that is good in that current generation, and they must find their mission, their struggle. Each generation has its mission. But, and they often quote Frantz Fanon in this. What they forget before that, in that same paragraph that Frantz Fanon speaks about, he also speaks about respecting the contributions of earlier generations and building on earlier generations. If we actually did push land, if we actually did go all the way, you wouldn't have had the democratic South Africa today.
Education being the first, no, because we're still striking with FISMAS 4, you know.
He sold us short. And I think there's just a lack of appreciation of the complexity that they were dealing with at the time.
But it's not just young people who have strong emotions about this icon.
For me, even beyond the sky is the limit now because of what he's done for our country. So I'm inspired.
He was the father of the nation, father of the world.
He was a normal human being with faults.
I think as a white South African, I can be here and really live the life and hopefully contribute the way that I am because of that. I mean, we forget things were looking quite dicey in 92, 93.
Madiba, as he was affectionately known, wasn't always affectionate. He famously refused to give up on the armed struggle during the violent early 90s until former President F.W. de Klerk stopped the flow of guns into the townships. Guns that spilled blood. It's estimated some 14,000 people died in political violence in South Africa. Madiba also gave orders to shoot when thousands of Inkatha Freedom Party members, an opposition party, marched on Shell House, the home of the African National Congress in downtown Johannesburg. But all things being fair in love and struggle for freedom, Madiba's political legacy is more nuanced in the years leading up to his presidency, agreeing to use his name, fame, and face to raise tens of millions of rands for thousands of needy children. But Nelson Mandela's ANC also promised housing, education, and health services in this national rainbowism idea. Easier said than done in a country broke and desperate.
As black people, a lot of us haven't profited from, or we haven't received what was expected.
I think Mandela strived for the emancipation of the country, for equality, for democracy, and what we're seeing currently is completely different.
Why do you think we don't always hear about Mandela's militancy side?
That's a good question. I mean, I think if you read his books or you're a student of history, you do see it. But I think he downplayed that in his later years because of the need for reconciliation.
They don't like the part about the militant Madiba who was prepared to fight for the poor. They don't like the part this is the guy who was prepared when under attack to say that there are some certain conditions when you have to fight. You don't always fold. You have to fight.
But Mandela's party politics were also not linear. Many say he wanted his chief negotiator during the CODESA talks, Cyril Ramaphosa, to take over from him. These were crucial talks that paved the way for one of the most liberal constitutions in the world and laid the foundation for a free and democratic South Africa. But party rank and file wanted Mbeki to lead. Mandela was invited to Nigeria in 1962 and twice again after his imprisonment, both times to a hero's welcome. Richard Akiebe was special assistant to Nigeria's Minister of Information in 1990.
He was received by Babangida and Miriam Babangida, and the ministers were there at the State House. It was power people. Everybody felt a sense of accomplishment because Nigeria had been part of the struggle to see the end of apartheid. So we were all very excited. It was like one of us had been set free. So yes, it was a very, very overwhelming visit.
Long before his lifetime prison sentence in 1964, Madiba kept close company with leaders seen as pariahs by the West. And as president, Mandela embraced former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi and Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe, much to the dismay of the West. But Mandela's liberal views upset some on the continent. In 1997, following Nigeria's execution of activists Ken Saro-Wiwa and others, Nelson Mandela recommended Nigeria be kicked out of the Commonwealth in protest, a decision which swiftly backfired. South Africa soon found itself short of friends as West African governments huddled together with Nigeria, diminishing South Africa's influence on the continent.
It was painful, even as I recall it, because nobody expected that Saro-Wiwa would be killed. And even the Minister of Foreign Affairs then, who I believe was Tommy Kimmy, was taken by surprise because he was in the Commonwealth meeting at that time. And he wasn't informed. He was still lobbying to be sure that Nigeria wasn't kicked out when suddenly the news came that Saro-Wiwa had been killed. It's still a pain. It's a blemish in our history because there could have been other ways in which his convictions could have been handled. I think you must understand governments and how they deal with each other. The fact that the West African governments opposed what Mandela said didn't mean that the Nigerian people, the ordinary people, supported the government or supported what the West African government was doing. what West African governments were doing, I think they were basically supporting one of their own. They were not echoing the voice of the people. I don't know if you get what I mean. Their support was not echoing the voice of the people. Their support was, they were supporting one of their own, and their own at that time was Abacha, who was quite influential, and Nigeria is the biggest economy in West Africa. We can throw our weight around and get people who, even though they don't agree with some of the things that we are doing, to agree with us publicly. But I think you must separate the feeling of the people from the voiced support for Abacha by a few West African leaders.
I think it did. I think it fundamentally changed South African foreign policy, by the way. So prior to, I think that there was a belief in 1994, 1995, that the mystique of Madiba would carry the transition, but that would play out in foreign policy. You saw that they didn't play out in Abacha's case, in the assassination of, or in the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa, but it did work in Mobutu Sese Seko's case, where effectively Madiba saw him down and forced him out of power. And so in some cases it worked, in some cases it didn't.
There was a time when his was the second most recognizable name in the world behind Coca-Cola. Nelson Mandela's stock rose markedly following his release from prison and subsequent presidency. Brooks Spector is a former cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy. He first arrived in South Africa in 1975. Through work, chance and love, Brooke has made a home in South Africa. He remembers meeting Madiba in 1990.
Back in 1990, when he was meeting the U.S. ambassador for the first time, I was involved in that meeting. And when Mandela arrived to the ambassador's residence, he walked in, and the first thing he did, he shook hands with the housekeeper who'd opened the door. Then he shook hands with the waiter inside, and then he went to the kitchen to say hello. Now, there was a man who understood that you win acclaim, you win connections, and you win appreciation one person at a time. You don't just do it standing in front of a big crowd and saying things. You gain confidence in people. In the U.S., even now, when you talk to people and you say something about where where I live, and they say, "Did you know Nelson Mandela?" And I can say with an absolutely straight face, yes, I didn't know him well, certainly, but I had met him a couple of times. And you can see the look on their faces of, whoa, wow, congratulations, great. So there is a residual level of appreciation and understanding.
But despite the adoration he received on his first tour of the U.S. in 1990, Mandela was held in contrasting views by Americans and the state.
Well, like any good politician, you try to be as real as you can be, and the image that is created, you try to both live up to that image, to inhabit it, and then to subtly tweak it so it fits you. So it doesn't look false, it doesn't feel wrong. A clever politician figures out what things they do that build the image they want to project, rather than run cross-grain against it. And he was nothing if not a clever man. And he understood that you take something like that, you shape it your way, and then it gets used properly, and then you can carry on that way.
Despite the public adoration, Madiba would remain on the U.S. terror list until 2008.
Well, the terrorism thing is one of these leftovers from the Cold War. I mean, over the years there was a list of terrorism people, and people's names were put on it, and under pressure from very conservative, right-wing members of Congress and other people in government perhaps too, people like Nelson Mandela's name got put on that list. And that was pretty much of a piece of the time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when it wasn't quite as clear to some people as it should have been that this was rather different than your standard garden variety terrorism.
Well, partly I suspect that there's I must say, I think partly it's just bureaucratic blunders. I think even under the Clintons, Madiba was seen as an icon.
Mandela's body politics continue to be a source of conflicting views. While his political days may be done with us, the argument over its legacy is far from so. From now on, there will be a seat in South Africa that will forever remind people who sit on it of the cramped struggle and the years of endurance Nelson Mandela endured in Robben Island. Lubabalo Mashikana reports.
It may not look like much, a park bench with bars. It tells one of the most harrowing stories of incarceration in South Africa's history. A reminder of the cramped years of lonely struggle for Nelson Mandela. Commemorations around the world and around the country continue. Today we're at Sandton City at the Nelson Mandela Square, where they've put this bench that I'm sitting on, which is the same size as Nelson Mandela's cell in Robben Island, and they've named it the Madiba Bridge.
It's in fact a permanent installation. We're actually looking at curating an area within the square that's dedicated, besides the statue, that's dedicated to the life and the history of Tata Madiba. So there will be a permanent installation, yes.
This could be the first of many.
Our particular, contribution towards it is purely voluntary, both from the city's perspective in terms of staff, as well as the politicians that are within the city. However, we do give of our resources. I mean, where we were participating throughout the city this week, painting houses, restoring sidewalks, improving the living conditions of various communities. So it does take a little bit of resources, but we do it out of kindness, really.
There are about 15 of those small Mandela art pieces around the country, and the man behind them says is aiming for 100. But who is going to foot the bill?
I developed a financial program with the Mandela Foundation. A company makes a donation to the foundation of 100,000 Rand. A portion of that is for the foundation, a portion is for the artist, a portion is for the project, and a portion is to build it. So if you think about it in a pie chart, it's quarters of pie charts. It has to be sustainable.
One of the people at this unveiling at Nelson Mandela Square in Sandton, Johannesburg, had a personal interest.
I think that we all have to come to the party. I think we all have to try and do something more. The fact that people are still living in shacks, people still living without electricity, kids going to sleep at night without clothes, without food, without blankets, I think it's unacceptable. So I think that it is incumbent upon all of us to really try and do our best. Obviously, government needs to come on board in a bigger way, and the private sector as well.
Celebrations and commemorations continue throughout the month of July. Every time you sit on this one, think for a minute about the cold, lonely, and cramped cost of freedom. Reporting for CNBC Africa, I am Lubabalo Mashikana in Sandton, Johannesburg.
After the break, is Vladimir Putin the most powerful man in the world? And if so, how can BRICS member countries, including South Africa, leverage that political currency to their benefit? More on the other side of this.